Right now, the largest American military buildup since this conflict began in February is moving toward Iran. Not trickling, moving. B-2, Spirit stealth bombers running sorties from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, a base from which a B-2 can fly a round-trip combat mission to Iran and return without landing anywhere in between. B-1 Lancers at RAF Fairford in England, engines warm, bunker buster payloads likely already racked on rotary launchers inside bomb bays that can carry 24 joint air-to-surface standoff missiles per aircraft. 2 full squadrons of F-16CJ Wild Weasels, the dedicated radar-killing variant of the Fighting Viper, touching down in theater fresh off transatlantic flights from Spangdahlem Air Base in Germany and from the continental United States. KC-135 tankers stacked in layers across European airspace, forming an aerial bridge that keeps every platform in the chain fueled on its way east. C-17 Globemaster IIIs and C-5 Galaxy cargo aircraft running around the clock, moving the time-critical equipment that Sealift cannot deliver fast enough for a buildup on this timeline. Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean seeing increased operations, and the Commander-in-Chief confirming to Axios that the United States is close to a final decision on a strike being described internally as bigger than anything launched against Iran so far. 13 consecutive nights of CENTCOM strikes on Iranian military targets. And the machine is still accelerating. But let's back all the way up, because to understand why this buildup is qualitatively different from the operational tempo that has been running for 13 nights, and why the specific combination of platforms being moved into position tells you something precise about what target the biggest strike yet is designed to reach. You need to understand the strategic logic being assembled in real time, the doctrinal shift in American rules of engagement that Secretary of State Rubio just put on the record, and why the political clock Iran has been betting on for this entire conflict is running against Tehran in a way it has never run before. Here is exactly where things stand. Over 13 consecutive nights, CENTCOM has executed precision strike packages against Iranian military targets without pausing for a single operational cycle and without confirming the loss of a single American aircraft. The most recent wave added communication networks to a target list that had already expanded through coastal radar systems, island forward positions, sensor networks, command centers in Tehran, ballistic missile storage facilities, hardened bunkers, drone production infrastructure, and IRGC naval headquarters. Communication networks are not an incremental addition to a targeting campaign. They are the nervous system that connects surviving elements of every other target category into something that can still function as a coherent military force, rather than isolated units acting without direction. When you reach communication networks after 13 nights of removing the sensors, the weapons, the launchers, the command nodes, and the production capacity, you are executing the final stage of the doctrinal suppression sequence that precedes the most significant strike in the campaign's architecture. The Wild Weasels in theater, the B-2s warming up in Missouri, and the communication networks now on the target list are all pointing in the same direction. President Trump simultaneously announced that $2 billion in Iranian money held by the United States will be transferred directly to the commercial shipping companies whose vessels were destroyed by IRGC attacks. The financial accountability dimension of that transfer is real and significant, but the strategic communication it delivers is more significant than the dollar amount. The regime attacked commercial shipping to extract revenue from the Strait of Hormuz, operating what J.D. Vance described on record as a toll collection operation that the mullahs panicked to protect when the Memorandum of Understanding began reducing their monthly revenue from $300 million toward $200 million. They made phone calls down to their generals in the Strait and ordered ships hit to protect a $100 million monthly revenue differential. That decision produced 13 consecutive nights of American strikes, a military buildup not seen since February, and now the regime's own seized assets being redirected to compensate the civilian victims of the attacks it ordered to protect its toll operation. The IRGC's extortion machine has been turned against the extortionists, using the extortionists' own money to pay the bill. Now understand the Aragci-Rubio exchange, because this is the moment that changed the doctrinal framework governing this conflict, and whose implications the buildup currently underway is designed to make concrete and undeniable. Iran's foreign minister Abbas Aragci went on record describing Iran's doctrine as an eye for an eye, proportional retaliation, one for one. The framing was deliberate and strategically motivated. By establishing proportionality as the governing principle, Aragci was attempting to place a ceiling on the conflict's escalation trajectory and to create a diplomatic context in which both sides could present the exchange as a bounded, manageable confrontation rather than an open-ended campaign aimed at something larger than trading blows over maritime incidents. It was also an attempt to establish rhetorical equivalence between the American military campaign, which has executed 13 nights of precision strikes without losing an aircraft, and Iranian retaliatory capability, which has been firing expensive ballistic missile inventory at Gulf partner countries with consistent interception rates, leaving the confirmed damage far below the claimed effect. Proportionality as a framing device works only if both sides accept the premise that the exchange is actually proportional. Secretary of State Marco Rubio declined to accept the premise. Rubio's response was a head for an eye, not an eye for an eye, not one for one, not proportional, asymmetric. Whatever Iran spends on an attack, the American answer costs more and does not scale down to match. Read that statement with the weight it deserves, because it is not rhetorical counterprogramming. It is the Secretary of State of the United States, on the record, announcing a formal shift in the rules of engagement governing the American response to Iranian attacks. The doctrine is now explicitly disproportionate consequence. Iran cannot establish a proportional exchange ceiling because the American side has publicly committed to exceeding any ceiling Iran attempts to establish. Every Iranian attack now triggers a response that costs Iran more than the attack it was responding to. The more Iran spends on escalation, the more it loses in the response. The eye for an eye framing that IRGC offered was the regime's attempt to bound the conflict on terms favorable to its survival. Rubio's head for an eye response was the explicit rejection of those terms and the announcement of terms under which the conflict's trajectory can only work against Iran as long as Iran continues its current posture. The IRGC's response to the escalating American campaign and to Rubio's doctrinal statement was to name RAF Fairford in England, the base housing the B-1 Lancer strike aircraft, as a legitimate target, and to describe that naming not as a warning but as a promise. This threat carries specific significance not because of its tactical plausibility, but because of what it reveals about IRGC institutional psychology at this stage of the conflict. An institution that is threatening to attack a NATO airbase in England while absorbing 13 consecutive nights of American strikes on its own territory, without its air force being able to engage the attacking aircraft, is an institution substituting rhetorical reach for operational reach. The IRGC cannot actually hit Fairford with anything that would survive the air defense architecture protecting United Kingdom airspace. It knows this. The British government's response, stating that the UK is ready to defend itself 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, reflects an accurate assessment of the threat's operational credibility. What the threat does accomplish is domestic Iranian narrative management, projecting the image of an institution willing to escalate to any level, rather than an institution that has been absorbing sustained damage for nearly 2 weeks and is now watching a buildup assembling that its leadership understands is aimed at something it cannot stop. Now understand the specific platform combination being assembled and why the particular mix of aircraft arriving in theater is the most analytically precise signal available about what the biggest strike yet is designed to accomplish. The Wild Weasel is the key. The F-16CJ configuration carries the AN/ASQ-213 HARM targeting system, which passively hunts radar emissions and hands targeting data to AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missiles. Before the Iranian radar operator being targeted has any indication he has been found. 2 squadrons, roughly 40 to 50 aircraft, have flown transatlantic and are now in theater. The Wild Weasel's job is suppression of enemy air defenses, specifically clearing the electromagnetic corridor that separates a strike package from its target by eliminating every radar system that activates to contest the approach. After 13 nights of Wild Weasel operations against Iranian air defense nodes, what remains of the IRGC's integrated air defense network is fragmented, degraded, and operating with the knowledge that activating a radar is an act of institutional self-destruction. 2 additional squadrons arriving in theater now are not reinforcing a capability that has been degrading Iranian coastal air defenses. They are assembling the corridor clearing capacity required for a strike package to penetrate significantly deeper into Iranian territory than anything the coastal and island-focused operations of the previous 13 nights required. Paired with the Wild Weasels, the F-35 brings 5th-generation stealth and the AN/APG-81 active electronically scanned array radar, which produces a sensor picture of the battle space that no other platform in the theater can match at the moment of engagement. F-35 variants from all 3 American services, the A model from the Air Force, the C model from the Navy, and the B model from the Marine Corps, are described as being present in the theater simultaneously, a multi-service integration that reflects the scale of the assembled package. The F-35 does not need to be close to a target to paint it with precision. It identifies targets, passes targeting data across the integrated strike network, and suppresses or defeats whatever remaining air defense architecture attempts to contest the package without breaking its stealth profile enough to present a viable engagement solution to surviving Iranian surface-to-air missile systems. The F-35 is the sensor layer that makes everything behind it accurate. Behind it, if the decision is made, comes the B-2 Spirit with the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator. 30,000 pounds of precision-penetrating capability, the most powerful conventional bunker-busting weapon ever built, carried only by the B-2, delivered at depths that nothing else in the conventional inventory can reach. The B-2 can fly from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, transit to Iranian airspace using its stealth profile to avoid engagement by whatever air defense infrastructure survives the Wild Weasel and Growler suppression corridor, release its weapons against hardened, deeply buried targets, and return home without landing anywhere between Missouri and Iran. The GBU-57 goes through reinforced concrete, through rock, through the geology that Iran has spent years and billions of dollars putting between its most sensitive facilities and the surface of the earth. Trump has named the target publicly and repeatedly. Any place Iran has even thought about having a nuclear weapon will get hit. Pickaxe Mountain, a big fat shot, right in the front door. The Wild Weasels clear the corridor. The F-35s paint the target. The B-2 opens its bomb doors. The GBU-57 does the rest. The logistics architecture running underneath all of this visible platform movement is the element that most urgently demands analytical weight rather than treatment as background detail. Getting a bomber wing, a Wild Weasel squadron, and the full complement of maintenance personnel, fuel, ordnance, and support equipment into a theater of operations is not accomplished with a phone call. It is weeks of choreography involving sea lift, airlift, aerial refueling, pre-positioning, and the coordination of logistics chains spanning multiple continents simultaneously. Sea lift moves bulk heavy cargo at 25 knots, which means weeks of ocean transit for the heaviest equipment. Anything time critical rides the airlift bridge, which is why the C-17s and C-5s are running around the clock in flight tracking data that is not being hidden from public observation. The KC-135 tanker bridge, stacked across European airspace at altitude, is keeping every platform topped off during the transit east, and tankers at that density and that altitude do not appear to maintain optionality. They appear when a decision has been made and the machine required to execute it has been set in motion. The buildup is not preparing for a decision. The buildup is the execution of a decision that has already been made at the level where such decisions are made, with the public confirmation from the Commander-in-Chief to Axios serving as the official acknowledgement of what the logistics picture was already communicating without words. Iran's reconstitution methodology is the tactical detail that explains why excavators have appeared on the CENTCOM target list, and why targeting them represents a strategic judgment as significant as any single weapon system struck in the previous 13 nights. The pattern has been documented across the campaign with enough consistency to constitute operational doctrine on the Iranian side. American precision munitions strike a hardened missile bunker. Iranian recovery teams arrive with excavators. The excavators remove the debris and the displaced earth. The access door is cleared. A ballistic missile launcher is rolled out from inside the protected space inside the mountain. The launcher fires. The launcher is pulled back inside the mountain. The mountain closes. The Iranian military has just converted a struck position back into an operational one using a piece of civilian construction equipment that costs a fraction of the missile it just deployed. The excavator is the mechanism that makes the bunker strategy viable across multiple strike waves rather than just the first one. Remove the excavator systematically, and you do not just destroy what the previous strike destroyed. You extend the duration of operational unavailability of surviving buried assets indefinitely, because the recovery tool required to restore function to a struck position is itself no longer available. Targeting excavators is the operational expression of a campaign that has moved from degradation to denial, and its appearance on the target list signals that the campaign's planners have assessed that simply destroying Iranian military assets is no longer sufficient, and that preventing their reconstitution between waves is now an equally prioritized objective. Now be honest about what Iran still has, because the strategic picture requires acknowledging the threat environment rather than pretending that 13 nights of strikes have left the IRGC without meaningful offensive capability. Iran still fields ballistic missiles. The inventory has been reduced from an estimated 5,000 at the conflict's opening to somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000. A significant drawdown, but still a substantial offensive capability when compared to the 0 missiles required to kill American service members in Jordan or to generate the multi-front simultaneous pressure that has been landing on Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan across recent operational cycles. Iran still has drone swarms, reduced from an estimated 50,000 to approximately 10,000, but still capable of generating the saturation attacks against which even sophisticated layered air defense systems must work at high tempo. It still has fast attack boats in the strait, though nearly 100 have been destroyed across the campaign, reducing the swarm harassment doctrine's execution capacity. And it still has the Russian intelligence assistance dimension that American officials are now assessing as a real factor in the improving accuracy of Iranian ballistic missile strikes on American positions in Jordan. The Russia dimension requires honest analytical engagement rather than treatment as a peripheral data point, because if the assessment that Moscow is providing satellite imagery and targeting data to Iranian missile teams is accurate, the American campaign's systematic destruction of Iran's own ISR architecture has been partially offset by a third-party intelligence feed from an adversary whose space-based surveillance capabilities exceed anything Iran could generate independently. Russia's strategic interest in prolonging American military commitment in the Iran theater is transparent. Every week, the United States is focused on Iran, is a week in which American support for Ukrainian defensive and offensive operations is diminished. Every American service member killed in Jordan by an Iranian ballistic missile that benefited from Russian targeting data is simultaneously a cost to the American military and a strategic benefit to Moscow in the Ukrainian theater. If Moscow has made the decision to actively provide targeting intelligence that contributes to attacks on American personnel, the consequences of that decision extend into every dimension of the American relationship with Russia in ways that the Iranian theater alone does not capture. The Ukraine dimension produced its own landmark development in this same operational period, one that deserves serious analytical attention rather than treatment as a footnote to the Iran campaign. A Ukrainian F-16 pilot has scored what is being reported as the first confirmed air-to-air kill achieved by an F-16 in Ukrainian service, downing a Russian fighter assessed as either a Su-33 or a Su-35. There are additional reports of a Su-57, Russia's claimed fifth-generation stealth fighter, crashing under circumstances consistent with a missile engagement. The Su-57 is Russia's most advanced operational aircraft. It carries a large radar, sophisticated electronic warfare systems, and has been presented by Moscow as a peer competitor to American fifth-generation platforms. A confirmed F-16 engagement that goes against a Su-57 forces a reassessment of the performance assumptions that have governed Russian tactical aviation planning over the Ukrainian theater. The F-16's engagement success, if supported by a Saab GlobalEye early warning aircraft providing the situational awareness to detect and target Russian aircraft before visual range engagement becomes necessary, represents exactly the kind of sensor advantage that determines outcomes in modern air combat. Who sees the other aircraft first is the decisive variable. The Saab providing that picture to Ukrainian F-16 pilots is doing for the Ukrainian air war what the E-2 Hawkeye does for American carrier-based strike packages over Iran. The outcome in both theaters, Russian aircraft and Iranian air defenses underperforming against American and American-equipped adversaries, reflects the same underlying principle. Sensor advantage at the system level determines tactical outcomes at the individual engagement level. Now look at the domestic political picture that defines the runway available for the biggest strike the Commander-in-Chief has said is close to a decision. Because the political clock is the variable that Iran's entire survival strategy has been betting on, and that the current window of maximum pressure is specifically designed to exploit before that clock works against the administration. Congress appropriated $95 billion specifically to fund this war. The War Powers Resolution that passed the House at 214 to 208, attempting to constrain the administration's continuing military operations, died in the Senate at 49 to 47. The resolution was largely symbolic regardless of its legislative outcome, with the Commander-in-Chief making clear that resolutions attempting to limit his military authority were not operationally binding on his decision-making. But the vote counts themselves tell a story that matters for the political timeline. The House margin was 6 votes. The Senate margin was 2 votes. These are not overwhelming mandates for unlimited continuation. They are narrow survivals of constraints that reflect genuine congressional skepticism about the conflict's trajectory and its cost. Public polling from the period surrounding these votes found approximately a quarter of Americans feeling the war had been worth its cost, a number that does not trend toward the kind of sustained public support that would allow an indefinite campaign without domestic political consequences. The administration's decision to ramp up to the biggest strike yet before these constraints become binding is explicitly connected to this political clock. The window in which the financial authorization, the legal authority, the assembled military capability, and the degraded Iranian defenses all converge is finite. The machine being assembled right now is the instrument for using that window before it closes. Iran's bet has always been that the political clock runs out before the regime does. This is historically not a crazy bet. American military engagements that extended beyond initial public mandate have repeatedly encountered domestic political constraints that forced resolution on terms less favorable than the initial military commitment suggested were achievable. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. The pattern of American political will exhausting before military objectives are fully achieved has been the foundation of adversary strategic patience against American power for decades. Iran watched those precedents. Its strategists studied them. The mullahs built their survival theory around the assumption that if they could sustain enough domestic and regional pressure to keep the conflict going past the point where American public opinion and congressional authorization became untenable, the United States would eventually accept a face-saving off-ramp that left the regime intact. That bet has informed every decision the IRGC has made in this conflict. including the decision to hit ships in the Strait of Hormuz to protect a $100 million monthly revenue stream, knowing the military response those attacks would generate. What has changed is the convergence of factors making the political clock run in the opposite direction from what Iranian strategists anticipated. The $95 billion funding authorization removes the immediate financial constraint that would otherwise limit operational tempo. The Senate's rejection of the War Powers Resolution removes the legislative constraint that would have required the administration to seek renewed authorization. The 13-night strike record without an aircraft loss removes the casualty constraint that has most reliably driven American public opinion toward demanding military disengagement in previous conflicts. The multiplier response doctrine embedded in the command chain converts each American casualty into amplified military action rather than political pressure to de-escalate, inverting the casualty to withdrawal political mechanism that Iran's strategists were counting on. And the commander-in-chief, confirming to Axios that the biggest strike yet is close to a final decision, signals that the administration has assessed the current moment as the window in which the convergence of capability, authorization, and Iranian defensive degradation is at its maximum, and has decided to use it before any of those variables shifts. The Houthi activation as a potential second maritime front is the external pressure attempt Iran is making to complicate this window before the decision is executed. The Houthi threat to blockade the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the choke point at the southern end of the Red Sea through which shipping transiting from the Indian Ocean to the Suez Canal must pass, would create the maritime encirclement scenario that simultaneously closes both the primary routing through the Strait of Hormuz and the alternative routing through the Red Sea. Iran is calling the Houthis to activate because Iran recognizes that the logistics and economic pressure of a dual choke point closure might generate enough international diplomatic pressure to pause the American campaign before the biggest strike executes. Trump's preemptive public warning that the United States will hold Iran directly accountable for any future Houthi attack on shipping, with major military punishment attached to that accountability, was the answer to that call before the Houthis could respond to it. By placing Iranian responsibility explicitly on the IRGC's account for any Houthi maritime action, Trump removed the strategic benefit Iran was attempting to access through proxy activation. The Houthis launch, and Iran pays the price. That exchange rate does not encourage the mullahs to make the phone call to Sana'a. The three simultaneous pressure tracks that have been converging on Tehran through 13 nights of operations, and that the biggest strike is designed to apply at maximum intensity, simultaneously deserve precise analytical treatment, rather than the shorthand of military, economic, and psychological that those tracks are often reduced to. The military track has documented results. Coastal radar networks across the southern coast and the Strait Islands largely eliminated. Fast attack boat fleet reduced by nearly 100 vessels. Drone production capacity struck in multiple provinces. Command centers in Tehran hit with the largest explosions this conflict has produced. Ballistic missile storage sites struck and sealed with bunker-buster ordnance. Communication networks added to the target list. The IRGC's integrated military architecture, the system that turns individual weapon systems and launch teams into something resembling a coordinated military force, has been progressively dismantled from the periphery toward the center. What the Wild Weasels and B-2 represent is the final piece of that dismantlement architecture, the capability to reach what Iran buried deepest and hardened most specifically to survive everything that came before. The economic track has compressed the IRGC's revenue base from every accessible direction. The Karg Island blockade enforced with direct fire against vessels attempting to breach it, eliminating the primary oil export revenue stream. Chabahar's operational infrastructure destroyed, closing the Indian Ocean backdoor that let Iran claim its trade, remained viable under blockade. The railway bridge corridor to China damaged, reducing the overland supply chain that Chinese freight had tripled along when maritime routes closed. $2 billion in seized Iranian assets redirected to the regime's victims rather than the regime's budget. Power generation infrastructure across southern provinces struck, disrupting the industrial activity that sustains whatever economic output still exists in a sanctions-constrained economy absorbing the additional pressure of an active naval blockade. The regime entered this conflict with almost no remaining economic resilience. The accumulated compression of 13 nights of targeted infrastructure strikes against an economy already at the margin of what the population it governs will absorb, is generating internal pressure that the IRGC's domestic security apparatus is having to manage simultaneously with the external military confrontation. The psychological track is the one operating on both the Iranian population and the IRGC leadership simultaneously, and it is the track where the biggest strike yet will produce its most consequential effects. The Iranian population is watching the IRGC's claimed invulnerability, the foundational legitimacy claim of an institution that has governed through force and ideological narrative for 47 years, be dismantled in real time on footage that circulates faster than state media can manage. They watched the January massacre kill thousands of their own people for protesting. They are now watching 13 consecutive nights of American strikes reduce the organization that committed the massacre's military infrastructure to rubble without the IRGC being able to stop, slow, or meaningfully punish the force doing the striking. The IRGC leadership is watching its doctrine, its deterrent posture, and its institutional credibility as a military force capable of protecting the regime and projecting regional power evaporate with each successive wave. The eye for an eye rhetoric is the institutional response of an organization that knows the eye it can offer is not equivalent to the eye being taken from it. The honest assessment of the strategic moment defined by this buildup requires naming what the biggest strike yet is most likely aimed at, and what the campaign has been building toward through 13 nights of systematic preparation. Trump has named it Pickaxe Mountain. The deeply buried nuclear enrichment facility in the Zagros Mountains, 2 kilometers from the destroyed Natanz complex, constructed with 6 years of Iranian excavation specifically to survive the GBU-57 that destroyed Fordo, and currently assessed by independent analysts and confirmed by satellite imagery to be at or beyond the penetration depth of the GBU-57 against its specific granite geology. The challenge of Pickaxe Mountain is not finding it. American satellites can read a name badge from orbit. The challenge is reaching it at the depth it was built to occupy, with the ventilation shaft geometry that the attack methodology at Fordo exploited, replicated against a facility that Iran engineered around the lessons of Fordo's destruction. The next-generation penetrator, the GBU-76B, is under development at Eglin Air Force Base as the weapon specifically designed to reach what the GBU-57 may not be able to reach at Pickaxe Mountain's depth and granite. It does not yet exist in deployable form. This is the gap that the current decision window is defined by. Pickaxe Mountain is not yet fully operational. The intelligence picture, confirmed by satellite imagery showing ongoing construction and hardening operations through July, indicates that the facility is getting closer to the point at which loading it with centrifuges and enriched uranium material becomes operationally relevant. The difference between striking Pickaxe Mountain before it reaches operational status and striking it after Iran has moved enriched uranium into it is the difference between destroying empty tunnels and recreating the confirmed but unverifiable uncertainty about buried nuclear material that Operation Midnight Hammer produced at Fordo in 2025. The window between those two outcomes is the window defined by when the next generation penetrator becomes available relative to when Pickaxe Mountain becomes operational. Everything moving toward the Gulf right now is the American military systems assessment that the window for using the current weapon against the current state of the target is either closing or must be treated as closing. Iran's request for a 10-day ceasefire in this operational context is the clearest possible statement of what a 10-day pause would actually accomplish. After 13 nights of strikes, the IRGC's reconstitution methodology, the excavators clearing the debris, the doors rolling open, the launchers rolling out, has been documented and targeted. A 10-day pause is 10 days of excavators working without being struck, 10 days of engineers assessing damage and implementing repairs, 10 days of Russian and Chinese supply flights bringing in replacement equipment and advisors to whatever facilities have been damaged enough to need their expertise restored. 10 days of the IRGC's institutional military infrastructure beginning to reconstitute in ways that would require the campaign to start the degradation process over from a partially rebuilt baseline rather than continuing from the accumulated position of 13 nights of sustained suppression. Iran wants a pause not because it is ready to negotiate terms that would satisfy American strategic objectives, but because it needs the pause to rebuild enough of what has been destroyed to negotiate from something closer to a position of residual deterrent than the current position of accelerating degradation. The decision that is close, the strike bigger than anything launched so far, is the American system's answer to that pause request. Not a diplomatic response, not a counteroffer of ceasefire terms, a strike package. Wild Weasels clearing the corridor. F-35s painting the target, B-2s opening their bomb doors over Iran, GBU-57s finding the ventilation shafts that Iran cannot engineer away because physics requires ventilation in any facility where human beings and sophisticated equipment operate underground, the weapon doing what it was built specifically to do. The target receiving the answer to the question it was built to prevent anyone from being able to ask. The buildup is not subtle because it is not trying to be. An adversary watching 2 Wild Weasel squadrons arrive in theater, B-2s running sorties from Missouri, B-1s warming engines at Fairford, and the commander-in-chief confirming to Axios that the biggest strike yet is close to a final decision is an adversary being given the maximum possible signal about what the decision is and when it is coming. That signal is itself a pressure instrument. Every hour that Tehran watches the buildup assemble without the diplomatic breakthrough that would make the biggest strike unnecessary is an hour of psychological compression, on whatever command structure still retains the functional coherence to process the decision the buildup is forcing. The mullahs are sweating. That is not an emotional observation. It is the operational function the buildup is designed to produce. And after 13 consecutive nights of American strikes that have dismantled everything they built to protect their power, the machines warming in Missouri are not a warning that the war is coming for them. They are the confirmation that it already has, and the biggest chapter of it has not yet been written.